I don't know. I'm going into my microphone and it seems okay. So,
All right, let's just
or
go then.
yeah, I'll be good.
Hoping that the spirit takes us on this one, right?
I see what you did there.
That's
Well,
all I'm gonna
if we
be. That's all I'm
do,
gonna be good for in this discussion.
we're
So, these corny puns.
I just hope we get away with it.
Okay.
See what I did
Took
there?
me a
Yeah?
second. I wasn't
My
expecting
pun
it.
wasn't as good as your pun.
No, yours is just a little more subtle, which is probably a compliment to you.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
All right. Well, hey,
yeah. Bring us in.
Bud.
Bring us in.
Bring us in.
This is
Welcome, everyone. Yeah, this is
Dude.
one of my episodes.
This episode of the Voyage podcast, where we're going to be talking about Spirited Away. We'll just say Studio Ghibli in general.
Yeah, you know.
Spirited Away, The Boy and the Heron. You're probably going to want to throw some stuff in about, Jacob. I haven't seen that one yet, so.
Here's the thing. So here's the impetus behind this week's episode is that Studio Ghibli, Hayao Miyazaki has put out his latest and greatest kind of magnum opus, The Boy and the Heron. And, so that's like, let's do Studio Ghibli. We haven't gotten around to really deep diving into them. And so what do? Mike hasn't seen The Boy and the Heron yet. So I have, or at least I saw some of it because, frankly, I was trying to corral one of my little kids the whole time. So I'm gonna go rewatch it. Basically,
not as attentive as you'd like, but
if you go and read any reviews for this movie, and I haven't read all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but it's remarkably I don't know what this movie was about, which is not true. It's just that they all lean heavily into the themes of the movie. It's about confronting death and stuff like that, but they don't seem. I think that this one really befuddled people. The Boy and the Heron. So maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to end up reading some more reviews because this will be.
If the title hasn't thrown you, dear listener, or Jacob's intro into Studio Ghibli and Boy and the Heron, just want to invite you guys to like and subscribe to the show. Leave a positive rating so that this and all of our other episodes, because we do try to do a range of pop culture, whether it's works or different stories, different kind of concepts that we try to cover. And so if this is one of the ones that resonated with you or any of them, I just want to invite you guys to do that too. You were going to say that, Jacob. Yeah.
We're going to do we always say that at the beginning? Or are we going to move it at the beginning because no one ever listens till the very end? Telling people to like and subscribe up front.
I think it's a common practice to put it in bookend it. So we'll try it out. We'll see what happens, right? What have we got to lose?
That's not much. So the Spirited Away was a movie that we both have seen, and it made a big splash back in the early 2000s. It won the Best Picture for animation, and frankly, I think there's a ton of parallels between The Boy and the Heron and Spirited Away, and so that evolved into an idea of doing a two-parter episode where we do a part one that discusses Studio Ghibli and the two films kind of very broadly, and then deep dive into Spirited Away, and then next week we'll do an episode that deep dives into The Boy and the Heron. Hopefully by that time, Mike will have had a chance to see it. We'll see.
By next week? Oh, man. Okay. I guess. I just thought, well.
Oh, you can do it.
Next
I believe in you.
Yeah.
And then we'll do a compare and contrast between the two films because there is a lot of really meaty subject matter. And frankly, just talking about Spirited Away is going to take up this entire episode. No doubt about it.
Yeah. And that's, I think you were referring to Boy and the Heron as the magnum opus. And I think a lot of people, especially Spirited Away is not the first one, but one of the early ones. But it definitely is considered a high watermark, not just in terms of animated movies, not just in terms of Studio Ghibli movies, but just in terms of movies in general, is widely considered, just really strong cinematic masterpiece.
Oh yeah, people really loved this movie, and I really enjoyed it myself.
So it's fitting that our first episode is going to kind of focus on like the original, and or again, not necessarily original, but like I said, the kind of foundational work. So,
well, it's kind of remarkable. Spirited Away is 20 years old. I think it's over 20 years old.
Yeah, I think 2001 when I was
mind.
looking. Yeah, when I was looking it up and stuff.
So there's 22 years between Spirited Away and The Boy and the Heron, and what is fascinating to me is because I did rewatch Spirited Away in anticipation of this episode. For one, the animation style of Studio Ghibli is just timeless. I mean, I've seen quite a few Studio Ghibli stuff at this point, and I mean, even their stuff from the 80s looks like it's from the 80s, but he crafted an art style, or that team there crafted an art style that is just remarkably timeless. And so it doesn't feel like there's a 22-year gap between these movies. Then you compound that with the themes of the two movies and how similar they are. I mean, this is the perfect double feature. If you can deal with like the weirdness for 4 hours, because one thing that's true,
it's kind of an acquired taste, and I don't say that I don't say that to undermine it. It's an acquired taste specifically for like we'll talk about Western viewers. That we really would just have to adjust to. It's like a high schooler the first time he or she reads Shakespeare, right? It doesn't make it,
I have a better analogy.
Okay.
It's like the first time someone from the West eats sushi. And so some people love it. Some people are like, you raw fish. And then some people, they try it a few times and eventually it grows on them. Okay. Right. And I think because it's Japanese and an obvious like analogy, but that's my analogy for Studio Ghibli. And it was way better than yours, Mike.
Jacob's analogies are an acquired taste as well. So it's an analogy on an analogy. So it does work on two levels. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why don't you like a Studio Ghibli film?
So you've seen it more often. You're more probably familiar with. If you want to kind of run us through just a very quick synopsis of Spirited Away, Spirit Us Away, Jacob, if you wouldn't mind. And
you want a quick synopsis of it?
And I might interrupt you with various things that we've talked about or things that are interesting to note. But if you want to, take us through, if you please.
Before we I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about Studio Ghibli as such, though, just as a little bit of a foundation, and specifically Miyazaki as a director, because I think that we need to lay that groundwork in order to make sense of Spirited Away. But then I will gladly take us on a journey, Mike, a heroic journey into one of our favorite topics, our favorite environments, the underworld, or the land of fairy.
It's timely. Yeah. It's time for it.
Yeah.
So,
well, I tell you, it feels like every episode's about the underworld these days, right? But it's just a perennial thing. No pun intended. See our perennial Superman episode. But, so Studio Ghibli is like the Japanese Disney. Okay. In fact, I'm pretty sure like Disney has some kind of like ownership or some kind of distribution rights or something. Of course, then again, that wouldn't make sense because you stream Studio Ghibli stuff off of
it's
HBO
Warner Brothers.
Max.
Yeah, it'd be Warner Brothers, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but if you watch the beginning openings of movies, like so, for example, Spirited Away, I think really was actually distributed by Disney or something like that back in the early 2000s.
I mean,
so maybe ownership just changed hands. But they are, I mean, me calling them the Disney of Japan is not unique to me. I didn't make that up. They are, frankly, I really enjoy them. I'm someone who, admittedly, it was an acquired taste. I didn't instantly fall in love with Studio Ghibli. The first movie I ever saw was Princess Mononoke because I was one of those like anime kids back in the early 2000s, and Princess Mononoke made a big splash. And I watched it. I thought it was very interesting. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, but I also didn't much care for the animation style. And it took me a while to really embrace the animation style. I liked kind of grittier, darker anime stuff.
Batman the Animated Series. Oh no, you meant anime. Sorry. I was gonna say the gritty, dark. Okay.
Well,
anyway.
and everyone kind of looks like a Gumby character in a Studio Ghibli film. They have a it's very gelatinous. They're very gummy. They're very gummy.
If you've seen it, I know what you're like. Someone who's seen it knows what you mean by that. So yeah,
it's hard to kind of describe. But What I really fell in love with is the fact that that kind of gumminess that I'm talking about, it's super expressive. And there's so much attention to detail in the animation of a Studio Ghibli flick that, and just the way people move, right? Everything
Mm.
almost feels like everyone's just kind of like floating in water or
I was
something.
gonna say
Um,
dreamlike. I almost said so.
yeah,
Yeah, the floating.
it, it's a thing for Studio
Mm,
Ghibli. And so it took me a while to like appreciate that. But once I came around on the sushi, it's like, oh, this is like awesome and unlike anything that you see Western, um, you know, studios putting out there as far as 2D animation styles go. Um, so what Studio Ghibli does is create movies that are profoundly influenced by the Japanese culture. And so when I say they're a Western Disney, I really do mean like we take for granted the tropes that come into play in like classical Disney stuff, right?
mm,
Like go back to anything that Disney made in the first like 60 years of its existence or the 90s Renaissance. And you're going to see things that are, they kind of come out of the Shakespeare mold, they come out of the Grimm's fairy tale mold, they come out of Western European molds, and a
mm,
lot of the kind of basic Christian concepts of good and evil and the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell would talk about it and point out, it it's in the water of these classic Disney movies, right?
mm,
If you watch Studio Ghibli, it's like seeing Japanese culture and experiencing like the water, right? Or the
okay.
tea,
Ah,
of
I thought you're
it's
the
been
leaf in the
steeped.
water.
Yeah.
You're the leaf in the.
Well, it's like it's been steeped in Japanese folklore as opposed to like Western European folklore and things like that. And
Sure.
you can tell. I actually think there's a certain level of like esotericism associated with Studio Ghibli movies in the sense that like oftentimes there's just like a strangeness to them, and the story beats have a kind of like surrealness to them. And
Mm,
oftentimes I get the impression when I'm reading other people's interpretations of these movies, a lot of them seem to be like, and then this happens, and then that happens. I don't really know why that happens, but but I love the feels, I love the vibes, I love the emotion, right? So they're able to focus on these human universals, but the
yeah.
actual logic of these tales doesn't sink in for a lot of Western viewers, so far as I can tell. And it's
Mhm,
because you really are watching films that are flavored by Japanese tradition, Japanese worldview, Japanese folklore and religion. Even though Miyazaki himself, he's not interested in any type of like institutional religion. I think he's pretty much just a nature hippie, frankly.
mhm.
But he loves Japan. I think the Japanese people really embrace their homeland. I think I don't really
Well,
know how it
and
is
that,
nowadays, but like,
because one of the themes that we're gonna touch on a little bit more, and I think is common in a lot of these, is like old world versus new world when it comes to like pre-modern versus modern or postmodern, and tying up like see even making the distinction between like a religious person and like a patriotic person that would not have been made basically
right,
pre what enlightenment, like that would not have been made for anybody, Western or Eastern, and the Eastern like sort of has retained that a little bit more strongly. And so, like you said, it's not so much a, the way that we think of like a devout Christian or a devout this or devout that. Um,
hmm
it's just, like you said, loving Japanese culture, loving your culture, loving like that would have been um, hand in hand with
Well,
it.
in the same way, dude, in the same way that Walt Disney wasn't, I don't think he's known for being particularly religious or anything like that, but he
Mm,
was very much a World War II era American,
yeah.
someone who grew up in the pre, lead up, during, and after World War II. And like, so he is a part of this kind of like golden age of American patriotism and American,
Which would have been hand in hand with this sort of modern kind of post Protestant Christianity, which many,
yes,
that's why they've rejected Christianity, is partially because it's been so tied up with Americanism or, nationalism. Well, back, like you said, post World War II, that would have been the positive. That would have been like a plus to
it
see
would
those two
have,
as
yeah.
together.
So
So
if you watch
similar idea.
Pinocchio, if you're looking at Snow White, Pinocchio, Cinderella, Beauty, Sleeping Beauty, these are fairy tales that are very steeped in Christianity. Christian morals, Western morals, at any rate.
Mm.
Whereas Studio Ghibli films, they're steeped in things like Shinto. They're steeped in things like, like close agrarian nature type stuff, and they're steeped in kind of like basically Eastern,
Well,
more or less
family,
Buddhist, Taoist type concepts.
family and honor as well. Yeah. So
Family's huge, huge, huge. And frankly, a lot of it's actually like a response to World War II destruction, right?
mm,
So a lot of it, he really is like a post World War II hippie. Miyazaki is, and but nevertheless, he still has a lot of love for Japan and for the culture. And his father helped make planes for World War II, so he loves a lot of things that you'll see in a Studio Ghibli film are all about flying. Frankly,
mm,
there's always something flying. He loves flight. He loves aviation. It's because he grew up with a father who made planes for World War II to fight during World War II. And so that shows up in The Boy and the Heron, which a lot of commentators have already pointed out is very autobiographical. But then I think a lot of people would agree that most of these films are really personal
mm.
and quasi autobiographical. But so we're going to get into how things like Buddhism and Shinto and Japanese culture have had such a profound influence on Spirited Away. And I think it's going to make sense of this movie. And then next week, when we talk about The Boy and the Heron, I think it's also going to make sense of that movie. And, people, I think they like to like look at these films and say, oh, it's like Alice in Wonderland, which
Mm.
I get it, because a Western audience is going to go watch something like Spirited Away
That's how we
and
make
be
sense
like,
of it.
oh, yeah, it's like Alice in Wonderland. And
Mm.
there's remarkable, yeah, I get that. Like, you could totally say that. That's not even wrong. But it's also, it's very much trying to put it into a Western box if you try to
Yeah.
put it into an Alice in Wonderland category. Um, Whereas it's far more of a good old fashioned, if you really want to put it into a Western box, what you're really talking about is a fairy story. And what you're
Mm.
really talking about is a journey to the underworld story. And of
Well,
course, fairy and underworld are basically just two sides of the same coin.
which, to be
Uh,
fair, Alice in Wonderland, you could say, is
you can, of
Journey to
course,
the
you can.
Underworld.
She
And
goes into a hole.
well, but also, and it's a and it's a very much just like Spirited Away. It's a coming of age kind of growing up. Like, it's a maturation that Alice has to kind of go through with, just like, and I can't remember the first name of the main girl. Is it Shen? Is that what she's?
Oh, in
Uh,
Spirited Away?
yeah,
Yeah, it's Chihiro, and then her name becomes Sen. Sen,
Sen.
S-E-N.
Sorry. Okay,
Yeah,
so I mean,
that's right.
that's also, I mean, it could just be seen as superficial, but it's, you know there's there's some substance there too.
No, for sure. When you specifically, this is the last thing I'll say, comparing Boy and Heron to Spirited Away, and then we'll really dig into Spirited Away, is that there's some real basic constructs that are set up out the gate. And so I actually put these into a little table so I could reference it, because
Mm,
what you have in the protagonist of Spirited Away is Chihiro, and it's about a girl who is having to move. It takes place in the 80s or 90s. I guess the
mm,
90s. I mean, I think it's actually contemporary, so it's probably early 2000s, because they reference the 90s, but it's a modern Japanese era.
mm,
Whereas the protagonist Mahito in Boy and Heron, that's World War II era, right? But in the modern Japanese era, it's all about economic forces causing pain for Japan. And Chihiro and their family, it's implied that they're moving, and she's a 10-year-old girl, and she's moving away from all of her friends and from the home she loves and having to deal with that. So it's a story of loss, and it's a story of her having to grow up and mature and come of age and stand on her own 2 feet in the face of like no longer having the safety of home and hearth as a child, right?
mm,
And Mahito, his takes place contemporary with World War II, so that's all about Japan being bombed. He loses his mother right out the gate in that movie to the fire bombings of Tokyo and things like that. So they're both about stories about children who have lost their home, and having to, and even Shihiro loses her parents right away too, and then having to grow up and deal with that loss. Right? They both immediately experience psychopomps, the fun word for people who carry people into the underworld. In which case you have Haku, who is a river spirit / dragon, in Spirited Away, and you have the Heron, in The Boy and the Heron. And then they both are taken into a foreign landscape, one being fairy in Spirited Away, the other one being basically eternity in The Boy and the Heron. But these are two sides of the same coin, like I said earlier.
Well, and I was going to say, going from time to eternity, that's kind of a death sort of movement, right? Because that's what happens when the soul leaves the body, is we go from time to eternity. So you could, and then just like fairy, you've mentioned the underworld, right? Obviously, that's place of the dead sort of language or imagery. So you have this sort of death, life to death, or experiencing a type of death, I should say, in both of them too.
Well, and I think that in both cases, fairy, the place of the supernatural, the place that's beyond, the realm of the senses that we currently inhabit and things like that. The reason why fairy and eternity are basically the same place is it has to do with kind of what the story is emphasizing. Because in fairy, it's usually handled in such a fashion that none of the rules of this reality apply there, but it's still it doesn't really play with the kind of like grand eternal elements that an eternity focused story would, right? Like if you're explicitly talking about visiting the afterlife, something like Orpheus or anything like that, like they
carries a little more weight. It kind of has a little more gravity to it.
Got a different vibe to it.
Fairy definitely has that lighter kind of
more of a whimsical, type thing.
Well, go back to Alice in Wonderland. No, like it's hard to imagine Alice in Wonderland being an underworld story unless you see the relationship between fairy world, which Wonderland, and then underworld. So that's where again.
So these really are just like the two. They're the same place. They're the same location. It's just like one has an emphasis on kind of the transcendence, and maybe fairy has more of an emphasis on the immanent, right? More of like a funhouse version of our reality or something like that.
Well, and we'll talk about hyper reality too in a second, but kind of goes with the Disney thing you were talking about.
It does. It does. There's going to see a lot of those themes here. So, all right. Enough. Let's get into Spirited Away.
See, even when I don't write the outline, I still read it, Jacob.
That's good.
That's
I'm glad that works for you.
Yeah. It's called professionalism.
Oh boy. Yeah. I guess I just need some growing up to do, Mike.
So, maybe you need to be spirited away. So they are on the road. And she's kind of sullen about this move and this transition, which again, okay, hint. And they get lost in the woods, which
is random because they're in a suburb. They're like in a suburban area, and all of a sudden the dad's like, "Oh, weird. Here's a shortcut." Take a shortcut, right?
Yeah,
these stories always take a shortcut. Yeah,
through the woods.
Here's a shortcut.
Okay,
through
Little
the
Red
woods.
Riding Hood. Yep.
Yeah, up to our new house that we can see in that neighborhood over there. Also got some real like Dante stuff going. They find themselves in the middle of the woods, right?
Yeah.
And even then, the whole like the signs, it lays it on really thick because there's like little spirit houses, Japanese like totems, like little homes for the spirits to live in, some like Japanese folklore stuff. There's kami shrines everywhere. And so briefly, a kami is basically just a spirit in Japan. And it is everything that we think of. One thing that everyone should understand about Japanese culture is it's like super pagan culture, right? I'm not necessarily talking about 21st century Japan, but Japan was extremely isolated.
Animism.
Oh, it is. Yeah. No,
animism,
this is.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say they are a time capsule, like up until like the mid 20th century, right? But like that's super recent. That's less than 100 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what we should understand is like medieval Japan was not 500 years ago, was not 1,000 years ago. Medieval Japan was about 150 years ago. And so the type
Tom Cruise
of
in The Last
saturation,
Samurai.
The Last Samurai, exactly. Yes.
Check that off the bingo card.
Saturation that is still super present in Japan is it's good old fashioned paganism, like real true blue, not kind of weird Wiccan stuff that's being made up.
Not post-Christian paganism, pre-Christian paganism.
This is pre-Christian paganism influenced by Buddhism, but it's all about everything has a spirit. You barter with the gods by giving them food. You ancestor worship. Family and tribe is everything. And it's these types of statements can be made about the Romans. These types of statements can be made about the Greeks, like because paganism was genuinely universal. And the similarities between the way an ancient Japanese person would have lived and the way an ancient Roman person would have lived are far more alike to each other than they are to us, for example. And so Spirited Away is an extremely pagan movie. And again, I don't mean hot topic pagans. I don't mean like New Age Wiccans. I am talking about the real thing. And frankly, as a classical Christian, I would say that classical Christianity has more in common, has more of a geography with, classical paganism than it does. It's, if anything, Christianity is just the inversion of classical paganism, whereas a lot of like New Age stuff nowadays is just kind of like piecemealing stuff together post Christianity. You know, so that's why you can watch something like Spirited Away, which is this like thoroughly like steeped in paganism movie, and still feel a lot of like,
It
Christianity.
It should go back to the common topic we bring up all the time, which is that seeds of the word, right? St. Justin Martyr talks about, or Irenaeus talks about the seeds of the word. And like you said, like we can still find it in a sort of post-Christian, like modern, like art, culture or artwork. When we look for things like, oh, look at this Christ figure in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or whatever. But it was very evident, and that's obviously what, in large part, converted, the
pagans.
It converted the world, right? It converted the world, because it was even not, I'm not going to say like more obvious, but I don't know if you'd say like it lended itself more to the fulfillment of Christianity than it might seem like it does. I mean, I would still argue that even in like quote unquote post-Christian culture, the seeds are still there, and it's just a matter of, Christians recognizing them in the way that we can recognize them, just like St. Justin Martyr recognized them in the way that he could. And so it's a different, it's not like a, I guess better or worse sort of thing. But
and I gotta say, I think one of the reasons why people really fall in love with Studio Ghibli is because it is like a really pagan studio, classical pagan studio. And I think that we're like a pro-pagan society now. One of these days, we should just do an episode that's just like titled "We're Pagan Now." Like our culture is pagan now. And here's why. Because it's crazy how post-Christian we are and how pro-pagan we are now. And Studio Ghibli, frankly, fits that mold really well, right? So a lot of the themes that we actually find inspiring as modern audiences, they're actually coming out of this pagan tradition, right? Christians took those good things and
the natural virtues, of justice, temperance, prudence, and fortitude. I mean, those are present in our human nature. That's why they're called natural virtues. And it's meant to be, that's the grace is supposed to build upon it. That's where the theological of faith, hope, and charity are supposed to build upon.
Well, and let me give a clear example of what I mean when I say that like modern people love Studio Ghibli because it's a pagan thing as opposed to a Christian thing. Christianity, as opposed to paganism, actually has concepts like good and evil. Okay. Now you're like, what are you talking about? Paganism had good and evil. It's like, not the same thing, man. Not the same thing. Christianity introduces this idea, the revealed truth of God all the way back to Genesis and Judaism into Christianity, Israel into Christianity, is that like, no, there is good, real good, not just power and not just effectiveness or utility. But there's actual good, there's actual holiness, and there's actual evil that wars against it, kind of thing. Whereas pagan society more or less just has like effectiveness or like usefulness or health, right? Again, things that Christians would call good, we would call them good things, but they're more of a basically utilitarian. Like, this is good because it helps me eat food. This is good because it helps me not die. It's not about a transcendent, like, truth, beauty, and goodness thing that we're beholden to, that we were created for. Because in paganism, like, the world wasn't created for anything the way it is for Christians. It's just something that exists, and we just kind of like muddle through it. We just do the best we can. And if we can coerce the spirits around us to help us live happy lives, then bully for us, right?
Mhm.
And if we can achieve power in order to crush our enemies, then bully for us. Like that's paganism, right? So it's total relativism. Paganism was a relativistic world, right? A pluralistic world, and Japanese paganism is no different. Like the good that we have in life, what is good in that kind of like pagan worldview is like happiness and peace and all that good stuff. But it's not the same kind of moral good that worshiping and serving the God who created you is.
Mhm.
Um, and so it just flavors everything, frankly. So Spirited Away doesn't really have evil characters in it. There is no like truly satanic figure in Spirited Away,
Mm.
right? Unlike Beauty or Sleeping Beauty has Maleficent, right?
Mm.
Just like a pure Satan figure. And the dragon in Sleeping Beauty is a devil character, and the dragon in Spirited Away is an angelic, guardian angel figure, right?
Yeah.
Because their worldview is not Christian. It's like there's no such like spirits are chaotic like D&D things,
It's
You
amoral. It's like a bunch of
yeah,
tricksters. Yeah,
their
I mean,
nature. They're nature creatures, right?
yeah.
They're beneficial sometimes they hurt you, and you live with them all the time because it's
Mhm.
just nature figures. They're nature spirits. And so chaotic good, chaotic neutral, chaotic evil, but there is no lawful good or lawful evil. There's
Mm.
just like what it is. That's paganism in a nutshell.
Mm.
Um, and that's Spirited Away's presupposition, right? The world that we're walking into. So to get back into the story, they take this shortcut into the woods. They end up at a tunnel that takes them out, and then when they get to the other side of the tunnel, it's like green grasses. It reminds me of like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings being like, describing to Pippin like what the afterlife is like. It's like rolling hills and sun on your face. And it's like that's what they walk into. It's like what happened to all the
Mm.
suburbia?
They went
But
through a
yeah,
dark tunnel, and the light at the other
yeah,
end was
yep. And
so. So
but
they all
they're
died, and the movie ends, right? Is that kind
yeah,
of yeah?
that's right. They go and the father and the mother represent crass commercial, like basically like the Western capitalism.
Like the
Yeah,
yuppie
the
sort of,
yuppie,
um,
like
because
robbing Japan of
he's
its
getting a
vitality.
new job, right? So like he's got this like corporate ladder kind of like that's what
Hmm.
prompts this move that prompts the angst in the young girl too.
Yep. And they're
So
super consumerist and they're unthinking. Like they make all these really, really weird decisions. Like, let's take a shortcut. That doesn't make sense. Let's rate like they're buffoons,
let's start
frankly.
eating this food that was just sitting
They
here with
come
like no
to
attendance.
well, they come to this structure that is that the tunnel is that we're talking about. And the first thing the father says is, "Oh, this isn't like real. This is fake." And it's implied that it's like a Disneyland type attraction, like the kind of plaster like construction that's made to look like an old building, but it's actually just like a plastic
It's a
thing
a
that was
facade,
created.
a
It's a
facade. I
facade.
mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's a
That's the
metaphorical
word
and
for
a
it. Yeah.
real facade. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that Spirited Away uses Disneyland or this idea of theme parks
Mhm.
as its underworld entrance, right? And that's going to come into play as to like what the underworld actually is in Spirited Away now. But when they first come up to it, they experience a fantasy world, a fantasy lands that's like a Disneyland type apparatus, which famously Japan has that Disneyland thing. We once upon a time talked about Disneyland being hyper reality, the semiotic from the mid 20th century, this idea of symbolism and like the
Mm.
academic study of symbolism. And they coined this idea of hyper reality, which is basically something that's more real than real. But the example that was given was Main Street USA in Disneyland, where you create a world that's totally fabricated, but it's meet the leave it to Beaver. Yeah, there you go. It's
It's
Andy
taking
Griffith.
the
It's
the real ideas that are kind of subconscious to America and making them visible. It's like
Making it,
shoving
yeah,
it in your face.
producing it,
Yeah.
turning it
Making
into
it,
a product.
you could say
that
it's giving it a body, you could say, right? They're sacramentalizing it in a sort of distorted way. I
Well,
mean,
maybe
in a distorted way.
you know.
Yeah.
One of the examples that we gave back in the other episode was like Stranger Things, and nostalgia as such is a kind of hyper reality. And then
Yeah.
social media and like Instagram fake, all that stuff is a kind of hyper. Like
I think that was our Matrix episode. Our Matrix episode, right?
the Matrix episode, yeah. So you're fabricating what you think reality should be, or what you want reality to be, right?
Yeah.
And everything that you use to fabricate that reality is basically symbolic language. So if you're constructing a fantasy world that's like all pleasure land and things like that, you know, what you choose to depict that is says something about your symbolic language and your values as a culture and things like that. And so that's where this concept of hyperreality came in. And I think that Miyazaki is introducing that. He's like, Japan is being destroyed by these basically non-native Western influences and economic impulses. You know, this is still 10 to 15 years after like the 80s, right? And Japan was huge in the 80s, you know, like, so it's about the economy changing. It's about an economy of scale taking over the agrarian soul of Japan, all the way going back to World War II. When Japan lost World War II and the West came in and basically set up shop, right? And to this day, we have Okinawa as a Japanese outpost out there. And, you know, there's a lot of people in Japan who feel like the West utterly destroyed Japan, right? And I'm not going to lie, they're not wrong.
Not just physically, but like spiritually.
Yeah, it's a different place. And, you know, I might be able to applaud that if I felt like we went in there and like replaced Shintoism with like Christianity, but we did not. We replaced Shintoism with commercialism and capitalism.
Well, and
you know what
to
I
go
mean?
back to the two parents, after they have gorged themselves, what do they turn into? They are consumers, right? They're nothing but
Pigs.
consumers. And so it's
turn into
consumerism. Yeah, that's the sort of metaphor for consumerism, right? That's the real culture that has been imposed on you know, like this world that he's sort of trying to illustrate.
Yes. Spirited Away is a major theme of it is just a commentary on how consumerism has destroyed Japan. And it's interesting, if this is like an underworld reality, it's implied that the humans are turned into pigs and then eaten by the spirits, by the kami. So the implication is that like there's a cycle of life thing happening where death, like the eating of humans, right? Like they get eaten by death, by the spirits, by the spirit world kind of thing.
You kind of got like a screw tape. Kind of got like a screw tape letters scene. The screw tape proposes a toast where they're eating the souls of the damned.
Yes, exactly. Eating the souls of the damned.
And what is it? These people have sold themselves to this, you know, and again, not that they would use the like conventional Christian terms of devil, but they've sold themselves to this evil, right? This thing that has betrayed its culture. And so then what happens to them? They become the consumed, right? The consumer.
Well, and that should invoke things like the Pleasure Island thing from Pinocchio, where like you go and give yourself over to your passions and you turn into donkeys. Yeah. In Studio Ghibli, you turn into pigs, right? And you know, Western pigs. So,
so like, and the difference too is like, so with the turning into donkeys, you know, obviously there's the connection of like, what are they acting like, right? They're acting like a bunch of asses, but they are beasts of burden, right? So it's like they have, because they've been enslaved to their passions, they become these slave animals, right? The donkeys.
Whereas industry, right?
Whereas what happens to the pigs? I mean, the only thing pigs are good for, they're not good for labor. They're only good for food. And so like the consumerism makes you good for nothing but being consumed eventually. Right, you just become the same food that you've been consuming. You just become the next meal.
Well, and what's cool about this movie is that it's going to introduce other ways of eating, and there's going to be elements of eating that are redemptive.
Spiritual redemptive eating. Yeah, what a concept!
Yeah, what? Yeah, exactly. And honestly, again, that shouldn't even surprise us that a pagan movie would have that, because eating with the gods was always a thing.
Yeah, that's human.
So. Yeah. That's just human. So, but yes, it becomes a real important element to this movie is this kind of redemptive spiritual eating that takes place. But it's contrasted with the gluttony of the bathhouse. So where Chihiro ends up,
We're like in the first 20 minutes of the movie still.
I'm gonna start speeding this up. We're running out of time. Okay,
Yeah.
so she wanders away from her parents because her parents end up turning into pigs. She doesn't realize that yet, though. They're sitting there shoving their faces, and she's super weirded out. Don't eat the fairy food, folks. If you ever know anything about fairy stories, don't eat their food. So she wanders off, and by the time she returns, she can't find her parents, and suddenly, like, the sun sets, so it becomes night. This is more death stuff. And now she's in the spirit world, and all of a sudden all these shadows, again, paganism, right? So all the humans are shades. It's just shadow people everywhere, kind of thing. And she finds her way to the bathhouse, which is where all the kami, all the angelic, demonic, godlike nature spirits, right? So when I say kami, just bear that in mind.
We're gonna get put into like the 1950s, like we're gonna get put into that's gonna be the algorithm. It's gonna mishear it and think of like, oh, we got a couple of McCarthyism, got a couple of McCarthy guys on the show.
This is KAMI.
Thank you, very good.
Yes.
All right.
When you think for the Japanese, kami is everything we think of when we think spirit, demon, ghost, god, deity, demigod, any type of spiritual creature. It's all lumped together. It's all just kami. Okay, that includes the ghosts of your ancestors. It's all kami, right? And there's infinite variety of kami. For a good Catholic scholastic person, you should be thinking, of Aquinas's point that no angel is alike. They're all utterly unique from each other. Like, it's not angels isn't a species. It's a infinite number of, well, maybe not infinite, but like, you get my point. Like, it's a just infinite variety of
each one is unique. Like, it's utterly unique, not just in like they have a different body, but like anyway, moving on.
So and there she meets her guardian angel Kami, who is Haku, who is a river spirit and a dragon, right? Because in the East, dragons are good spirits, right? The serpent in the garden gave us knowledge, folks, right? So again, nothing surprising here. This is a pagan story, and so of course the dragon's a good guy. But he says, hey, hold your breath. If they catch you breathing, they're going to know you're a human. And she's not able to do that as she's trying to enter into the bathhouse. And so she has to flee. He says, go all the way to the bottom of the bathhouse. So she has to descend further into the depths of the underworld and demand a job. And as long as they have to give you, like, you have to demand a job. Don't leave until you get a job, right? And so the basic idea is that she has to work her way up through the bathhouse towards enlightenment, right? And so it's a redemptive arc. Her maturation,
like a karma thing.
Her maturation into adulthood is redemptive. It's finding her telos. It's finding her purpose in life, and it's going to be through hard work, right? And it's going to be through ingratiating yourself with the spirits and things like that. And so that's what the rest of this movie ultimately is.
Which, again, to kind of not to almost like redeem this concept or this idea, but like you said, ingratiate yourself to the elder spirits, to the ancestors. I mean, there is truth to that in like any young person's maturation, right?
Every classical Christian should appreciate the fact that we have saints, that we believe in good works.
They become our models.
We become, like, repentance is behavior. Repentance isn't wanting to be better or feel. I mean, it's wanting to be better and all that, but like, it's what you do, you know. Like that,
it's action speaking louder than words. And
exactly,
to go back to our Renee Girard episode of like our desires are modeled after those that we consider to be the models. And so if your models are the ancestors, that would have been considered a very good and pious thing. And in like you said, a classical Christian standpoint, our ancestors, quote unquote, are the saints who should model our desires, and then our actions will follow. And that's how we become saints. I mean, that's pretty straightforward stuff.
Developing your relationship with the angels, with the host of heaven, developing your relationship with the angel of the Lord, who is Christ.
Angel. It's like that's
the guardian. Like, none of this is offensive to my Christian sensibilities, right? I'm just describing the story, but it's like everything I can look at and say, as a Christian, I understand how this applies to me. but it's just fascinating that it's flavored with this kind of like medieval Japanese paganism, right? So
they're ripe for conversion, man. They're ripe for evangelization. I mean, straight up. Like,
that's the idea. That's the idea, folks. You know, when she's trying to enter in, she actually comes face to face with a frog. And there's a pun. I had to look this up, but there's a pun in Japanese culture where the word for return is the same word for frog, right? They're spelt differently, but when you say the noise for those two words, you're saying the same noise. And so that developed in Japanese culture this common cultural pun of frogs are these kind of liminal characters where like you either have to, if you encounter a frog, you got to turn around, or it's like a sign of like a karmic, like what goes around comes around. Like if you're going to proceed, you're going to get what you asked for. It's going to return. What you give is what you get. It's going to return to you, right? So whenever all the kami patrons, like not patrons, but the personnel in this bathhouse, they're all frog-like. They all look like frogs. They have the weird frog features, and so I think that's how I read that, is that it's this idea, this kind of karmic reality.
Well, and you know, you mentioned Dante a little bit ago when the family was lost in the woods, and how that's the beginning of the Divine Comedy. And you know, the more common term that people are probably familiar with is karma, where it's this kind of like cosmic justice. You kind of said what goes around comes around, where the very sin itself becomes the punishment. And that actually fits really well with Dante's concept in the Divine Comedy called the contrapasso. And the contrapasso, as Dante is going through the different levels of hell, he's experiencing the different sins, right? Hell is leveled by the different sins, and the punishment in each circle of hell, it quote unquote fits the crime, not just in intensity, but it fits the crime by its nature. That it is like you said, it's a sort of karma or cosmic justice or a contrapasso, in that, you know, just as a really quick example, the schismatics, the ones who divide groups, especially divide Christian groups, what is their punishment is that they are cut by a demon holding a huge sword. Or the sins who gave themselves over to lust, it's like their soul has been turned around over and over because it's untethered to this desire. And so what's their punishment? They're in this huge tornado or storm. And so like it's basically kind of what you were describing, where, you know, again, the more common term people might use today is karma, but go back to Dante's Divine Comedy. It's the contrapasso just repackaged in this other sort of, this other image.
Well, even, you know, Christianity absolutely just has this basic idea that you get what you ask for, that it's all grace, frankly. Like a lot of this, you can't, like, God gives us freely. And the people who want Christ get heaven, and the people who don't want Christ get hell. You know,
get what they want. Yeah,
they get what they want. You know what I mean? And so, the other element that's interesting about this bathhouse is A, bathhouses are a thing in Japanese culture. B, it's a purification symbol, right? It's baptism. It's the water, the cleansing of the water. And that's, you know, even basic Shinto ideas of purity, because again, it's not, and you see this in the Old Testament, like purity laws in the Mosaic Code. This is something that a, you know, Japanese Shinto practitioner would understand, because again, it's not so much about good and evil. It's about clean or unclean. It's about what's useful and what's not, or what's healthy and what's not, right? And so the idea of bathing in Japanese culture, and famously Eastern peoples, like, you know, when the Western peoples like Marco Polo first came over, they're like, you guys stink. You guys smell so bad. Don't you bathe ever? Because Europeans didn't really have like a culture of bathing. Yeah, be embarrassed, Westerners, be embarrassed. But the Eastern cultures like China, and I'm sure Japan as well, are like, take a bath, man. Take a bath, you people. But
we're
so anyway,
busy,
that's wrapped
we're too busy
into
conquering the world to take. Too busy exploring and conquering the world to, you know, who's got the time, who's got the luxury,
who's got the time to bathe when we got all these people.
They've been burdened with glorious purpose, Jacob. To revert back to
fair. That's a fair point. So anyway, but like, so purity is an important thing in this idea of, it's kind of like a feng shui thing of just like being in the right, being right, being correct. It's a Buddhist thing. Um, and so that means being clean. And so that's what the bathhouse is. But here's the thing, especially in places like Japan or Eastern cultures, the interplay between the spiritual world and the physical world is way more of they inform each other. In the West, I think that we're very much like the demon. We're either like we are worked upon, right? And we do have an idea of like petitionary prayer as working upon Christ, working upon the saints or whatever, but
Mm,
it doesn't feel like we are trying to coerce them. And it doesn't feel like an exchange. It's not meant to.
mm,
Obviously, like bad versions of Christianity can like, put you there, but it's meant to be a relationship thing and a petitionary thing. It's not an exchange. It's not a quid pro quo, right? But in
well,
Eastern
yeah.
pagan cultures, it still is everything. And so, like, there's an economy between the spiritual realm and the physical realm of the humans. There's a marketplace there. So when you see the underworld in Spirited Away, it's taking on the capitalist consumerist realities. It's not a one-way street. The humans are changing the spiritual world in profound ways by becoming greedy and capitalist and consumerist and things like that. And so the bathhouse, this place of purity, this place of cleansing, has become a kind of crass consumer business model. And
So you
everyone
need
that
somebody
works
to
there
flip
is
over
just
the
about making a
tables.
buck.
You
Yeah.
need somebody to
Yeah,
flip over the
exactly.
tables.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
need,
They
yeah,
need a Christ
some
to come
righteous
in and
anger.
yep, make some whipcords. Because that's exactly what you see. It's exactly what's happening
Mm,
in Spirited Away. It's not meant to be this isn't heaven. You know what I mean? This is the afterlife, or this is the underworld. This is
mm,
fairy. So these are not moral exemplars. The pagan
mm,
gods are not moral exemplars, right?
mm.
And so there's so much to talk about. I'm just going to run out of time on all this. All right, so I'm just going to race to the finish line, I guess, because we're just running out of
Looks
time.
like you're gearing up for a part 3 now. It looks like.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh my
I've tried
gosh.
not to do that. I'll try not to do that to our loyal listeners.
Yeah.
But this place is run by this evil witch named Yubaba, but she's not actually an evil witch. She's just a maternal figure that is like the dark side of maternity. She has a
Mm,
sister that basically becomes known as the Granny. And Granny is, at first, when you first meet her, she seems like a bad guy, but it turns out that she's actually like the benevolent half. And then by the end of the movie, it's basically depicted because Chihiro refers to them both by the same name, and
mm.
they're identical twins. They're one reality. It's a yin and yang
It's like a two
concept.
sides of the same coin again,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah. So it's just like, and again in Taoism, like the idea of the transcendent is more of a motherly figure. So it's like the eternal mother, but
Mm,
it's not good or evil, it just is. And so you have two sides of this one entity, this granny slash mother entity. Yubaba is actually, I looked this up, is taken from Japanese folklore. She's like a mother witch figure. So
like
that's
a
actually just like,
Stregonona from, if you remember Stregonona from the
I'm
Tamadapala
not sure.
book, and no, that's all right. I don't mean to
Oh,
derail
well,
you.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, moving on. Like
Yeah.
she's like
But
an old maid though, like an old maid sort of.
well, and so it's funny. One of the things that got me thinking is like, this is you have two forces of feminine reality reflected in a benevolent grandmother and an
Mm,
overbearing and spoiling mother. And then you have Chihiro, who is the maid. She's like the young girl growing up kind of thing. And so you actually
mm,
kind of have all three, the crone, the mother, and the maid, as
yeah.
like your kind of like main shakers in this movie. Um, Haku, her guardian angel spirit dragon river thing, um, it is being controlled by the evil mother, and is wounded by the grandmother again, because they're not clear good evil parallels here. There's just like mother realities.
Mm,
So Chihiro takes it upon herself to go and save Haku, who's helped her out so much, and get forgiveness from the benevolent grandmother. And in the act of having been working at the bathhouses and like, finding growth and maturity, she ends up saving another water spirit, which gives her a dumpling. So a common food item, but it's this bitter dumpling that has actually got like spiritual health benefits. And so there's two characters that need it. One becomes Haku because he gets wounded trying to steal stuff for the evil mother. And she gives him, she's going to use this dumpling to try to save her parents, right? So it's this ultimate like love sacrifice to try to like redeem her parents. Those crass consumerist pig parents. She wants to bring them back from the dead. She wants to bring them back to life, to true health within agrarian Japanese pagan society. And so she's going to use this magic dumpling to do it. But as the movie goes on, she ends up taking half of it to save Haku. And then she ultimately uses the other half to save another character we haven't even mentioned yet. And that's No Face. Now, No Face, again, because there's no good and evil here, what No Face is basically just like the spirit of desire. And so
it kind of is presented as like scary at first. Like you
he
get,
is. It's supposed to be like
he's
a dark figure. He's in the
like
shadow side
self,
of
shadow
this world.
Self, yeah.
But like he's also a pathetic figure though, and like a sympathetic figure at times. But then at other times, like, so again, he's chaos. Like he's chaotic, right? Like he's just a force. But that force, he is the product, he is the creation, he's the spirit of the kind of capitalist consumerist greed that's taken over Japan, right? So he's like the dark shadow of that embodied in this faceless, I have no tradition, I have no face, I have no identity. I'm just consumption.
You've just
I'm
become
just hungry.
Nameless, faceless consumer, basically. So you're a nobody.
Hunger. Yeah. And so the entire it explains every action he takes, because sometimes he seems like a sad, pathetic person who's trying to be helpful. Like he wants to be friends with Chihiro Sen, but like he's doing it in all this kind of like, I'll give you a bunch of stuff. Hey, if I give you a bunch of gold, you'll be my friend, right? Like, and like he can't possess her because she's really kind of like this A, pure child, and B, she's maturing into a good woman. And so like she's not tainted by his hunger,
the manipulation,
right?
Yeah, like
his manipulate. She cannot be manipulated because she can't be brought into the quid pro quo.
Even attempts at love are still self-service from his standpoint.
Yeah, it's a distorted. He's a distortion, right? To use some good Catholic talk there. And so
I mean,
well, like,
yeah, sure,
because there's nothing wrong with wanting love, but like it can be a distorted passion.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, like, so he can't basically seduce her with greed or what he can offer her, and he comes out of control and he starts to eat everybody, right? So you have more example of like consumption and just eating everybody and things like that. Well, eventually she gives him the second half of that dumpling, and it causes him to vomit out all the things that he's consumed, but he's still a pathetic, sad, I'm the spirit of hunger and desire and I'm never going to be satisfied, right? And so he journeys with her because her example of love gets her a train ticket to see the grandmother, the granny. And she's like, you want to come with? And he's like, sure, okay. And so like he doesn't talk, but like or he does talk, but only with the voice of other people. It's very dude, there's so much to like decipher in this movie.
It's a cool
profound.
identity thing. You could do a whole episode just on his character, but
you sure could. But anyway, he travels with her to Granny. She takes the child of the evil mother with, and everyone experiences a redemptive arc when they visit the benevolent grandmother who forgives Haku, or what's his name? The dragon guy. Yeah, Haku. And she keeps, so again, you learn to live with hunger, right? And so hunger is removed from like the society of Kami, so he can't do any more damage, but he's not destroyed. And he's kind of embraced as like a sympathetic figure, and he just goes and lives with the benevolent grandmother.
It's
and they're
not
gonna hang
full
out.
healing. It's the first step to possibly.
Yeah,
healing.
it's kind of like the
not.
stuff we talked about back in like the Babadook episode. You just like you learn to live with the reality of it, kind of thing. But he's gonna be safe in the loving embrace of the benevolent grandmother. The crone and stuff like that. That allows Chihiro to go back. We never talked about how her name was stolen by.
I know the naming thing is
the
big
evil
too,
mother.
which again it ties in with the No Face character too. But
yeah,
identity.
We'll talk a little bit more about this probably in the sequel episode of this, just to tie a few loose ends up so that we can contrast them with The Boy and the Heron.
Yeah.
But she gets back. She is able to see through the deception of the evil mother to get her parents back. Haku is liberated from the evil mother through the sacrificial love of giving him the dumpling that Chihiro did. And she remembers that he saved her from drowning when he was a river. And the Japanese paved over the river. And so he doesn't have a home anymore. And that's what sent him to the bathhouse to begin with. And so he became the slave of the evil mother because his home was paved over with concrete. So there's lots of ecology themes going on. And
they took paradise and put in a parking lot. Basically.
That's exactly what they did, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have to wrap up, right? Because we have a deadline. So you know what, folks? I could have talked a lot more about this episode. We'll talk a little bit more about it.
And you will.
But
and we will.
Yeah. So
well, this was a good start, and it's a fine part one. But this will, I mean, we definitely talked about some of the major themes that we wanted to. And like you said, once we get to go into Boy and the Heron, we'll be able to kind of see some of those parallels too. I mean, this one, it required a lot of sort of legwork or foundational work onto
talked a lot about
the nature of this
and
stuff in general, which
like
is a good, it's a good foundation stuff. So, but yeah, anyway, thank you guys for coming to listen to this episode of the Voyage podcast. And just another reminder, since Jacob, remember we got to bookend this, right? With like and subscribe, leave a positive rating, positive comment on the show, just that it gets out to more potential listeners, potential viewers. And we just look forward to the next time we get to make this. So thanks, Jacob.
Thanks, Mike.
Spirit us away.
I got nothing. I'm brain dead after trying to spew out all of that dialogue, exposition.
Well, then we better just end it now.
It's right? Like I ate a bitter dumpling.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.